Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links deck profile. Today we're taking a look at, I guess it's kind of a deck we're revisiting. This is insects with a bit of a weird engine in it, but this is all off of the back of DYNAS DORCUS the Beetle King, which is a new UR that you can get from the card trader. So this new boss monster is interesting. So we can shuffle 3 monsters from our graveyard into the deck, destroy one face-up insect-type monster with a level between 5 and 8 on the opponent's field. This turn you can only attack with insect-type monsters. So this card is a little bit awkward because we can't pop 4 and lower and we can't pop 9 and higher, which is already a bit of a red flag because a lot of the best decks right now are playing big fusion monsters and we won't be able to deal with them particularly easily. On top of the fact they have to be an insect monster, so we have to combo this together with one of our cards that can change our opponents into an insect monster. And we also have to shuffle 3 monsters from our graveyard into the deck, which isn't too steep of a requirement, but it is just an extra added layer of complexity to actually get this to work. So when this effect does work, and when we actually do get to remove a monster, it's actually very strong. Effectively, we can get rid of one of their guys, which is effectively another direct attack with one of our monsters, which is pretty good. But on its own, this card isn't going to win any games, which is why we have included Ancient Gear Golem. And again, if we're not playing a skill that locks us into specific cards, Ancient Gear Golem is almost always a must to include. And it's even better now because we do have Joint Tech Leo no longer limit 3, which means we can play this at 3 copies, which means once Ancient Gear Golem is online and it's in rotation, we can keep getting it back with Leo, which is really, really strong. So this deck is basically insects, but also Ancient Gear Golem Turbo, and to facilitate that we do have the Legend Draw skill. Now this skill is a little bit awkward, so it can be activated during your normal draw on turn 4 or onwards, so again, can't use it turn 1, 2 or 3, that's pretty annoying, and only if your opponent has a face-up level 7 or higher monster and you have no monsters on your field and only once per duel. So this is quite annoying. The primary issue we kept having with this, that we would always end up with a monster left on our field, so we never really had this live. We only actually used this a couple times during testing, but when we did use it, getting Ancient Gear Golem straight to hand is very, very powerful. So the skill isn't particularly good, but again, we just don't really have an insect skill, so this is the best we could come up with. Now, I will preface this by saying, this build is not very strong. This is a fun list, it's not very competitive, and I think realistically, if we wanted to play a more competitive version, we should play the Dai Gyakuteno build, because that can actually almost sort of reliably out big monsters, whereas this deck cannot. So I guess we'll go for the card by card. We've already spoken quite a lot about DYNAS DORCUS the Beetle King. It does have that 2500 attack, which is a really nice attack stat. Unfortunately, it only has the 1700 defense, which is not a great defense stat and also does mean that All-Seeing Harvey can pop it. Now that won't come up too often, but it can come up. Ancient Gear Golem is again just the best monster in the game, probably the best card individually in the game, like in a vacuum. 3000 defense and 3000 attack, absolutely fantastic, as well as inflicting piercing and not letting your opponent activate battle traps is just insane. Again, we have the Leo just to keep getting back the Gear Golem, and then we have Polygon Butterfly at 3. So if we have 3 or more insect monsters in your graveyard, we can send the top card of your deck to the graveyard, choose one face-up level 8 or lower insect-type monster on your field. This turn, that monster gains 200 attack and make up to 2 attacks on monsters. So our best target for that is going to be the DYNAS DORCUS. Unfortunately, it only goes up to 27, and 27 is not really a very relevant number. Sure, it lets us attack over other 25s, but we can't get over 28s, which are quite prevalent in the meta right now. So that's a little bit disappointing, but making 2 attacks on monsters is pretty good. This is another way for us to effectively beat set 3 pass and get a lot of damage in. The only negative of Polygon is it's only got 400 attack, so ideally we want to already get a DYNAS DORCUS out, then summon out the Polygon, then use Polygon's effect, and then tribute the Polygon off, which is not always super easy, so it can get a little bit awkward, but still, it's a reasonably good card. Then we have Swapling Silkworm Fibron. So if we have a face-up insect-type monster on the field, other than this card, then the top 2 cards of your deck to the graveyard, one face-up monster on your opponent's field becomes an insect until the end of the turn, and this is what is primarily going to turn on our DYNAS DORCUS. So a really decent effect. Unfortunately, only 100 attack is quite weak, so again, we're going to want to summon this, use its effect, and then tribute it off, ideally. Then we have Biomech Mantis, actually a really, really good card. Its attack stat isn't fantastic, but it's a lot better than some of the other cards we've already spoken about. But we can shuffle an insect-type monster from your graveyard into the deck. One face-up monster on your opponent's field loses 300 attack until the end of this turn. Then you can make that monster become insect until the end of the turn. So another way to transform our opponents into insects. Also, it reduces their attack, which is pretty good, and it recycles, all of which are really strong effects. Then we have Dramoth Caterpillar, send an insect from your hand to the graveyard, draw a card. Really good just for filtering. There isn't really much more to say about this card. We want it because it's an insect. We need a critical mass of insects, and filtering can be really useful. And then we're only playing 2 copies of Flying Kamakiri, and that's because I felt like the other monsters in here had more of a purpose. Kamakiri was basically just a spare beater, so we're only playing the 2. We could put in another 4 1500 vanillas, but we'd have to take other things out. Realistically, I think the only thing that could come out is probably the Dramoth Caterpillar, and even then I think I'd rather have the Caterpillar. For our legend spell, we're playing Pot of Greed. Now, Pot of Greed is really good, but one thing to take note of is this deck doesn't really have good ways to out maximum. We just have the 1 copy of Talismanic Sealery. So I think if you were to play this deck very hyper competitively, I do think Tribute to the Doomed would be a better option, but the card economy wise, it's not super great. We'd have to give up an extra card to use Tribute to the Doomed, whereas Pot of Greed gives us extra cards. So the way that we've tried to build this deck is to specifically try and counter decks that aren't playing level 9s and up. So unfortunately, that's not going to be many decks, but I think we've already kind of come to the conclusion that we're not really going to be beating maximum decks. So rather than try to spread ourselves thin, trying to have an out for everything, we've tried to hyper focus at dealing with decks that we will be good against. And I think that's how we've had the most success. Whether or not it's the correct option is kind of neither here nor there. This is the deck that we played to have fun. We had a really good day of games of this on the ladder, and we really did enjoy ourselves playing it. And Pot of Greed, again, just giving you a free plus can be really, really valuable. Then we have Intruding Beetles. If you have 2 or more face-up insect monsters on the field, send 1 card from your hand to the graveyard, draw 1 card. Then you can destroy 1 spell trap on your opponent's field. So this is filtering as well as back row hate. It's just a really good card. The only real negative is that we have to have 2 face-up insects, which means Jointech Leo isn't going to work with it, Ancient Gear Golem isn't going to work with it, and sometimes we'll only want to have DYNAS DORCUS face up, but we'll have to summon another weak monster in attack mode in order to get this effect off, and if our life points are low, that can be a little bit compromising. So we're on the 1 copy of Talismanic Sealery. Again, I think if we were trying to play a very serious build of this deck, I think we would probably play more than 1 of this, but it's hard to fit it all in. Basically, Talismanic Sealery a lot of the time feels a bit weird because ideally we're going to be popping our opponent's level 8 and lower monsters with DYNAS DORCUS, with things like the Insect Rampage, so we won't really be leaving anything on the field to reduce the attack of. There was one game we played where we got double DYNAS DORCUS out, managed to use both of their effects to pop 2 monsters, and then we popped the 3rd with Insect Rampage, and Talismanic Sealery wasn't really doing anything. So Talismanic Sealery, although it's a really good card, doesn't really fit with what the rest of the deck is doing. We already have plenty of shuffling back between DYNAS DORCUS, between Biomech Mantis, so we don't really need that recycling. The reduction effect is still good, and again, against specific decks like big fusion monsters, big maximum monsters, it can be a must, but overall it doesn't really gel with what the deck is trying to do. And speaking of, we do have the Insect Rampage limit 1, and this is very annoying just because we'd really like to play Rice Terrace Crisis in this deck, but we can't really fit it. But we can shuffle 2 monsters from your graveyard into the deck. All face-up insect-type monsters on your field gain 300 attack until the end of this turn. Now this can be very relevant because that means if we get out, for example, like DYNAS DORCUS, and we give it a Polygon Butterfly effect, we get up to 27. Then with the Insect Rampage, it'll get an extra 300, putting it to 3000 attack that can make 2 attacks on monsters, which is actually pretty good. If your opponent has a face-up insect-type monster, which again we have 6 ways to make our opponents become insects, we can then destroy 1 face-up level 8 or lower monster, and notably this is any monster. We don't have to destroy the insect monster that they have, we can destroy any level 8 or lower monster, they just have to have an insect. So actually, very, very strong. And if it wasn't for the level 8 or lower restriction, this card would actually be completely bonkers. For our Legend Trap, we're playing the Gate Attack. This is just the best option 99% of the time. There's no real reason not to use this. It is just the best Legend Trap. Then we have Buffered Slime. Again, this deck specifically is built to beat level 8 and lower decks. This is going to be things like Light Galaxy, things like Dark Galaxy. We're trying to focus the deck to have a better matchup against the decks that aren't going to be spamming out fusion monsters constantly and aren't going to be maximum summoning. So Buffered Slime definitely does make sense, even though it can be a bit awkward in the current meta because Psychic only half cares about it, Metarian doesn't really care about it, Dragon Fusion doesn't really care about it, so Buffered Slime, although it's fallen off a little bit, is still pretty good. Then we have the Forever Freeze, which again, quite good into a lot of the current meta. Again, not really good into things like Psychic and Metarion, but it is really good into Dark Galaxy. It can be really good into Light Galaxy. It's really good into Dragon Fusion. There are a lot of decks that this card trip up, and we have seen a massive uptick in Forever Freeze's usage since Mirror Gearstar has released. So again, the only card we really want to be including in here is Rice Terrace Crisis, and that is because, again, this is really good against both Galaxy decks as well as a handful of other decks in the metas, but we can't fit it alongside Rampage. Now, we could just take out the Rampage and put the Rice Terrace Crisis in, which again, might actually be the better option, but in testing, we were trying out Rampage because, again, we want to play an insect deck. This already has 4 non-insects in it, but we really want to try and stick to the insect theme as much as we can, which is why we didn't try to push our luck by putting more non-insect cards in the deck. So how does the deck play? The deck it's reasonably fun, but it's not overly competitive. I think realistically, the Daigakateno Megami version of this deck was a lot stronger. Being able to pop any monster is so much better than DYNAS DORCUS being limited to 5 and 8s, and it can hold the deck back quite a bit. This is good enough to cog with. I think this deck is strong enough to like climb ladder with, but I wouldn't recommend taking this to a tournament. And I think if you want to play insects that bad and you do have access to the Daigakateno, I would play that instead. But this deck is still fun. I still really like DYNAS DORCUS the Beetle King. And I think, again, if you want to just play a more pure insects, it's not really pure insects because we do have this machine package in it, but this is probably the best version of this we're going to get. You could also potentially replace DYNAS DORCUS with the Angler Digra, because that monster can get up to 3200 attack, and then we can give it double attack. That will be better for clearing bigger monsters. But again, we want to play with the new card, and the new card is Beetle King, so we've put Beetle King in the deck. I know Beetle King isn't very good, but we wanted to build a deck with Beetle King. We built a deck with Beetle King. We had fun with the Beetle King. Beetle King. But let's fire into the replays so I could show you what I've been talking about.